It's April 4th, 2025. I spent the last 4.5 years working on a passion project of a video game called The Path of Ren, which I'm about to release on Steam. I'm excited and nervous. But most of all, I feel ready to be done with this project, ready to see what fate holds for it, and ready to move on to whatever the next thing might be. Years of hard work, of constant learning, of putting myself out there and challenging myself to create in public, of holding true to a story that I wanted to tell, and of plenty of sacrifice. And now, with the push of the release button, this journey has come to an end. Hey everyone, my name's Trevor, and this video is going to be quite a bit different from anything I've ever put out on this channel before. If you're not familiar, I've mostly done educational content focused around creating core software systems for video games, but today is a bit of a special day for me. It marks exactly 1 year since I released The Path of Ren on Steam, which is a video game I spent about 4.5 years, so almost half a decade of my life working on. And since releasing the game, I've had the idea of doing a retrospective kind of video, but quite frankly, it's felt very heavy to talk about. But with that said, after giving myself some space this last year to process what this experience meant to me, I find myself wanting to share a glimpse of what it was like. And so, I'm going to do my best to explain what led me to create a video game, talk through the journey of making it, and reflect a bit on the whole experience. And after that, I'll also talk a bit about what's next for Shaped by Rain Studios. And it should go without saying, but this video is going to contain a lot of my own opinions that I've formed based on my own experiences. That doesn't mean I'm correct or anything, and you're welcome to disagree with anything that I say. My intentions with this video are not to tell you what to think, but hopefully to give you something to think about. And so, without further ado, I hope you find some value in what I'm going to share. I started working on The Path of Ren somewhere around August of 2020 during the COVID pandemic. I was 27 years old at the time and had been working as a professional software engineer for a little over 3 years or so. When the COVID pandemic hit, like many others, I was sent to work from home, and without office distractions or a commute, I found myself with some extra time on my hands. But let's back up a bit. I've always been a very creative person, and I've always needed a creative outlet of some sort. For about 7 years of my life, through most of high school and college, I was a core member in a metal band called As the Sky Darkens, where I played guitar and also was a key contributor in writing a lot of our music. I even got the experience of touring the Western United States with the band a few times, which I have a lot of core memories from. Also, from the fairly young age of about 14 or so years old, I've always really enjoyed working on creative projects of some sort, many of those either being music related or being small video game prototypes, usually either built with GameMaker, OpenGL, LibGDX, or Unity. But most of those projects would never see the light of day outside of maybe a few close friends that I'd show. And like many, I even chose to go to college for computer science, not because I loved math or anything, but because I loved the idea of being able to build out all of the ideas that I had. I've also always been very interested in making a career out of game development, and computer science felt like a path where I could pursue that while also having a lot of safe fallback options. So anyways, after graduating from college, for various reasons I found myself working not in any sort of creative industry, but instead working for a large corporation as a software engineer. It was a pretty cushy position, and there were a lot of really good things about it, but more and more as time went on, it felt creatively suffocating. I was increasingly questioning things like purpose and fulfillment and what those things meant to me. What do I really want to accomplish in life? What kind of person do I want to be? What kind of mark do I want to leave on the world? And does any of that even really matter? And so, like I had mentioned before, during the COVID pandemic, I was sent to work from home for a little while, which gave me some much needed space to think about those questions even more than I previously was. I searched for answers to those questions through a lot of different means: self-reflection, YouTube content, books, and more. A couple books of which I want to share because of how influential I feel like they were in my decision to go on the game development journey that I did. The first being a book called Crushing It by Gary Vaynerchuk, which highlights success stories of people building viable businesses related to their passions through growing a brand on social media. At this point in my life, I had never released a video game before, but I wasn't a stranger to building and releasing other things, like music or various flavors of software. A couple notable solo-developed examples being a Japanese phrasebook application for Android inspired by a trip I took to Japan, which unfortunately had less than 10 downloads throughout its lifetime, and a World of Warcraft add-on called Pug Hero, which did have a decent amount of downloads throughout its lifetime, but didn't have any clear path to monetize or build a business off of. With the Japanese phrasebook app, I was lacking market fit as well as really any marketing or sales strategy at all. And with the World of Warcraft add-on, I was lacking a brand to leverage that project's attention as a stepping stone to whatever the next project would be. The book Crushing It was really eye-opening for me because it helped me understand that building a business was a lot more than just building a product. The second book I want to share is called Unscripted by M.J. DeMarco. The entire book revolves around what the author calls the script, which refers to the typical path that most people in American culture tend to follow, that being going to school, getting a job, buying a house, starting a family, investing their money in the stock market, and eventually retiring. His main claim being that we're indoctrinated to follow the script as part of our upbringing, which means to walk more unconventional paths like entrepreneurship, it's necessary to unlearn some of the behaviors that keep us following the scripted path, thereby living an unscripted life. This book resonated with me because I've always been someone who felt very unsatisfied with walking the conventional American path, and it helped me understand why on a deeper level. It also introduced me to a more entrepreneurial way of thinking that felt much more aligned than what I was doing with my life at that moment. It's a huge book and I can make an entire video on it, but if I had to pick one nugget of wisdom related to my decision to create a video game, it would have to be what the author says about time. That is, as part of the script, we're taught that the way to make money is to trade our time. However, time is our most valuable resource and usually isn't worth the money that we trade it for. In a capitalistic market, it's not time that equates to money, but value provided that equals money. Thus, if you can create value separate from your time, then there's no need to trade your time anymore. I know now that this sentiment is echoed in a ton of business books and isn't original to this book by any means, but Unscripted is the first time I heard this concept, and it resonated deeply with me because I loved building and working on creative projects of my own, and this bit of wisdom was a justification that maybe I could build a more fulfilling life doing just that. Anyways, after having given my future a lot of thought, I wrote down a bunch of options for different paths I could start going down and different niches I was interested in pursuing. And hopefully it's clear with the context I've given so far, but this wasn't just about building another project to me. It was about building a reputation in whatever niche I decided on digging into. I chose video game development because it felt like a through line in my life thus far and also touched a lot of other subjects I was interested in, like psychology, music, art, design, and more. I chose to create a platformer game because it was a personal favorite genre of mine. From growing up with games like Spyro, Crash Bandicoot, and Rayman, to more modern-day precision platformers like Super Meat Boy and Celeste. Although I did find through my research at the time that platformers didn't sell very well, and by making one I'd be at a marketing and sales disadvantage. But I decided to ignore that because my research also showed that making a game of any genre was rather risky, and regardless of if the game did well or not, creating it would still be a valid path to a more important goal, which was building a reputation in the game development world. Looking back on it now, I do wonder how much the game genre could have changed the experience that I was about to have. Like I mentioned, platformer games were a favorite of mine, but I also really liked strategy games, which according to the data are easier to market and sell on Steam by quite a bit. With this being my first commercial game and marketing being a weak point of mine, it would have been in my best interest to give myself as many advantages as possible. Don't get me wrong, contributing to a game genre that I love was worth it in its own right, but what I'm trying to say here is that I wish I would have taken my research findings more seriously and not underestimate the importance of genre in the indie game market like I did. Of course, it's easy to say these things in hindsight, but otherwise, this is what I was thinking at the time and what led me to start my game development journey. And so, I created an empty project in Unity called Platformer and got to work. I chose Unity as the game engine for this project mostly because of familiarity, but also because it was a solid choice for creating 2D games. And while researching how to implement good character movement for a 2D platformer, arguably one of the most important systems for the game I wanted to create, I stumbled across a project by the Mix and Jam YouTube channel, which was recreating the core player movement from the game Celeste in Unity. Celeste, without a doubt, was a big inspiration of mine when starting this project. It was a modern precision platformer that told a compelling story, which more or less is what I wanted to do. And it also had what's regarded as really smooth feeling player movement for a platformer game. So I downloaded that mix and jam project, did my best to understand it, and implemented the pieces I liked into my own project. Of course, it wasn't long before just about everything regarding the player movement was rewritten, which happened probably a total of 7 or 8 times throughout development before I finally locked the movement in, but that mix and jam project gave me a solid starting point at the time. And with that, even though I remember feeling extremely nervous to do so, I made my first social media post about the game on Instagram, which, looking back on this, even 6 years later now, I feel very proud of what I said. When you play a video game, listen to a song, read a book, or consume another form of art, you're enjoying the end result of a long and difficult journey the creator took to get there. You don't see the struggles, you don't see the countless failures, you don't see the bad decisions. You just see the polished end result, the success that comes from learning from many mistakes. This is what a project looks like in the very beginning. It isn't glamorous or unique, but it's an absolutely necessary step towards creating something spectacular. You have to start somewhere. That's how art works. I'm starting a new project. It's a video game. This is my starting point. I have a pretty strong vision for where I want to take it, although it may be a bit ambitious. Also, I'll be documenting my progress, process, and knowledge on social media to the best of my abilities. This isn't the first, second, third, fourth, or even fifth game I will have started, but it'll be the first one I plan to finish. The first step to creating something is simply starting it. And start it, I did. In that post, I mentioned that I had a vision for the game. I wanted to express what I felt it was like to go on an ambitious, creative journey based on my previous life experiences thus far, while also digging deeper in the topics I was struggling with, like purpose and fulfillment. With that in mind, the game would be a precision platformer with 5 distinct zones, each representing part of an ambitious journey, or put differently, the pursuit of a dream. And so here they are, along with some slides that I dug up that have some of my initial inspirations for what I wanted each zone to feel like artistically. The first zone, called Renewal, which represented the excitement and beauty of having a dream. The second zone, called Forest, or later called Exploration, which represented the adventure of exploring and acting towards a dream. The third zone, called City, or later called Distraction, which represented the life distractions, both necessary and unnecessary, that pull us away from a dream. The fourth zone, called Fear, which represented the fear and doubt that causes one to give up on a dream. And finally, the fifth zone, called Temple, or Ending, or Finality. I called this a lot of different things throughout the process, which represented the hard work and dedication that leads towards the accomplishment of a dream. And when one dream ends, another one begins, restarting this cycle indefinitely and representing what I saw at the time as a life's journey. I use these themes as my compass for every single decision in the game going forward, from deciding on what colors to use to deciding what the story would become, to the game's audio, and even to the game mechanics and level design for each of the 5 zones. However, that was just an idea, and what would matter was my execution of it. And I knew that one of the biggest challenges for me was going to be the art. I identified as more of a programmer and always struggled when my projects reached a point where I had to try and make them look nice. I was aware of this, and so with this project, especially since I was posting my progress on social media, I wanted to start learning the art and animation side of things as early as I could. I spent a lot of time in these early stages of development learning about color theory, animation, and trying out all kinds of different art styles to see what might work best. All the while posting on social media and trying to use that as validation for if I was getting any good at it or not. These early stages were also packed full of creative decisions that would go on to shape the game's identity, many of which I made based on personal inspirations or references. For the platform art, I chose to go with 16x16 pixel art tiles because the game Celeste, which I mentioned was a big inspiration for this project, also used that resolution. And that resolution also felt approachable at the time based on the little experience I had with pixel art. The initial draft of the main character was heavily inspired by one of my favorite manga and anime series called Attack on Titan, where I incorporated the uniform colors of the characters in the show and also gave my main character a red scarf, which is rather symbolic in that story. My very first drafts of the game were me trying to create a 2D platformer version of something like Snake Way from Dragon Ball Z, which was a very influential show for me growing up. I chose to go with pages as the main collectibles in the game, as this was a staple to have for modern platformers. Celeste had strawberries, Super Meat Boy had bandages, and this game would have pages. I chose to go with birdhouses as checkpoints and birds scattered throughout the levels because my main development partner in all of this was a green cheek conure named Taki, who you can bet is in the credits of the game. Some of these things made it into the final cut of the game and others were reworked entirely. But all of these decisions and my attempts to execute on them were me trying to find my bearings with this project and figure out what art direction might be feasible for me as a solo developer, which as you can see by a lot of these early posts full of harsh colors and mismatched resolutions, that this was quite the learning process. That said, it's really interesting for me to look back on this now because as these social media clips progress, I can see my learning starting to pay off. And even in some of these very early clips, I had some really interesting raw ideas that I wish I maybe tried to flesh out a bit more. Like these clouds that are in the background that aren't pixel art but kind of look nice as a background element. Or the same can be said for these cherry blossom trees that had an almost watercolor kind of feel to them. Or perhaps that's just me looking back on these clips with a bit of nostalgia. Next, the game's audio was also something I wanted to start implementing sooner rather than later. And very early into the project, I had a friend who goes by Sad Ghost Sounds, which is how I'm going to refer to him for the rest of this video, reach out to me asking if he could do audio for the game. My original intentions were to do this project entirely on my own, and audio was one of the things I actually had experience in and felt like I could do rather well. And so I gave this a lot of thought, but eventually decided to meet up with him, discuss the vision for the game, and figure out if it was something he was on board with. It turns out he was, and we ended up collaborating, which was without a doubt one of the best decisions I could have made throughout this entire journey that I almost didn't make. He wasn't just involved in the audio, but was a huge platformer enthusiast like myself. He was someone who I eventually found myself bouncing ideas off of and playtesting with regularly to get feedback on where the game was going. Undertaking a project like this can feel very lonely after a while, and even though we were only collaborating on audio with various feedback here and there for other things, I feel like this made a huge difference in my enjoyment of the journey. Anyways, speaking of getting feedback, playtests were also a big part of the early stages of this project. I'm a big fan of a methodology called design thinking, which I won't go into detail on here, but a big part of it is getting real feedback as early as possible, with the goal of using that to shape and improve a product so that the end result, hopefully, is something that people actually want. That, and put simply, I also just wanted to share what I was building with friends, and having them play what I had created so far was a lot of fun. Probably more fun for me sometimes than for them, as these early builds of the game were extremely unpolished and often brutally difficult, and not in a good way. But they were also extremely helpful in figuring out where I was succeeding and failing when it came to my execution of the art, programming, and more. Ultimately, they helped me with reining in the identity of what this game would be. And with the game's identity finally starting to feel more clear to me, I was between two names for the game. Wholehearted, which spoke to my vision for the game I had mentioned earlier, being an ambitious journey that one takes wholeheartedly, and of course, the Path of Ren, which spoke more to the main character of the game going on that ambitious journey. During some of the playtests that I did, I pitched these names to get feedback, and it was pretty unanimous that the Path of Ren was a stronger name for the game, with the more specific feedback being that it felt like it had more identity, personality, and uniqueness compared to the alternative. And so, a little less than 1 year into the project, April 12th, 2021, I announced the game's name as The Path of Ren. And not long after, on May 10th, the first cut of the game's official Steam page went live as well, showing one screenshot for each of the 5 zones in the game. And so, the game's identity was starting to come together, but there was still a ton of work to be done. It was also around this time that I was trying to figure out how I wanted to approach other parts of growing my brand as a game developer, and I had decided that a crucial part of that would be creating longer form content on YouTube, that while potentially related to the game, would also be considered standalone from it. Throughout my college career and for a lot of the previous projects I had done, YouTube tutorials were a huge part of my learning experience. And so, for me, even though this was primarily about building an audience, it felt just as much about giving back to the community that had helped me so many times before. My first YouTube video was a tutorial on how to recreate the main character's hair movement from the game Celeste, which was a pretty interesting algorithm, and at the time I had also just implemented this for my main character's scarf in the Path of Ren. To my surprise, I actually got about 60 or so subscribers just a few days after releasing that single video, which was far beyond my expectations and told me a few things. First, people wanted tutorials like this, and second, perhaps I had a way of explaining these kinds of things that people liked. And so, alongside developing the Path of Ren, posting on social media a few times a week, and working a full-time job, I started doing educational YouTube videos as well, having created some of my best performing videos to date, like the dialogue system and save and load system tutorials, within the first year of posting on YouTube. And I was also finding other success through these YouTube videos that I wasn't even expecting. I made mistakes that were pointed out in the YouTube comments, which ultimately helped me find some of the gaps in my own knowledge. I got invited to a program called the Unity Insider Program, which is full of a bunch of well-accomplished content creators in the educational game development space, which I'm still a part of and feel extremely honored to be. And I met all kinds of other people trying to do the same thing that I was, trying to make a game, but also trying to be heard. But as fulfilling as putting out YouTube videos was, it also took an incredible amount of work to create the kind of content that I was. Most of my videos took anywhere from a couple of weeks to a full month to make, which if I wanted to finish my game wasn't going to be sustainable. So as the game's release got closer, I stopped putting out content on YouTube as frequently and eventually stopped altogether to focus on the game. My original intentions were to pick up creating tutorials again at some point after the game's release, but that never happened. I'll talk about what's next for me and this YouTube channel at the end of the video, but for now, what I can say about what I did on YouTube during this time is that it was well worth it, and in retrospect is one of the accomplishments I'm most proud of throughout my entire game development journey. Anyways, back to the game, I would say that working on the project started to feel a bit different a little over 2 years into development. At this point, the game felt like it had a fully formed identity, and to reflect that, I commissioned some professional cover art to give it the best shot I could at marketing. I also had rough prototypes for most core systems in the game, with small demos for each of the 5 zones. Development was becoming less about making creative decisions and more about fully executing on the decisions that I had already made. What I had at this point was the game's foundation, and there was a ton of work ahead of me to take that foundation and turn it into a fully realized game. So I continued on. I took those small demos for each of the 5 zones and expanded on them, fleshing them out to the point where they contained hours of gameplay for each one. I reined in the story and implemented dialogue to facilitate that story across the entire game. I was forced to fix long-lasting bugs that had been present since starting the project, some of which I had attempted to fix several times before and failed, which required me to rework entire core systems of the codebase. I had built a lot of the game up to this point as an inexperienced artist, and now having learned more, I found myself redoing color palettes and redoing a lot of art for consistency. I was also communicating with sad ghost sounds throughout all of this, doing my best to capture all of the sound effects, ambience, and music compositions that needed to be created. And if that wasn't enough, I was also trying to level up my marketing strategy. To mimic the educational content that was doing rather well on my YouTube channel, I started creating short-form content showcasing how I was creating specific mechanics for the Path of Ren, which would be by far my best performing content related to the game, at least on TikTok and Instagram. And after all of that grinding and incredibly hard work, I finally released the game's first official gameplay trailer in March of 2024, almost 4 years after I had started the project. This marked a massive milestone, and at this point, each zone's visuals and the core mechanics of the game were locked in. But even more importantly, I felt confident in them. However, that certainly didn't mean that the game was finished, which brings me to the final push up to the game's eventual release. The final year or so of development for this project was by far the most challenging it's ever been for me to work on a creative project that I've undertaken. When it came to development, what was left to do were the most difficult things. And I wasn't trying to put those off or anything, but some of which I kind of needed to because my vision for them was something I hadn't built up the skill set for until this point. Like the page implementations, for example, which were one of the more difficult things to create for me personally, as there are 50 of these in the game, each which I wanted to carefully craft to highlight the greater story that was being told. Additionally, my social media reach, which I felt like was slowly growing throughout most of the project's development, also seemed to drop off of a cliff. Some of my short-form content that was once doing really well and getting in the tens of thousands of views on occasion was now rarely breaking more than a few hundred views, which in retrospect I'm still not completely sure what changed. I think it could have been anything from a change in the market to a change in the algorithms on these platforms, or it could have even been that I was just creating worse content. But to test that, I did try reposting content that historically did really well, and even those attempts couldn't break me out of the few hundred view cage that I was in. And of course, since I was starting to approach release, I also started reaching out to press. And out of around 50 or so cold emails I wrote during this last stretch before the game's release, that I felt were well written and personalized, I received exactly 0 responses. Put simply, the last year or so of development was a combination of the hardest work I had to do on the game, coupled with receiving a lot of different signals that the game probably wasn't going to do very well. And that's a clear recipe for burnout. But regardless, I didn't want those signals to turn into a self-fulfilling prophecy or anything, so I continued on with my best efforts. And by November of 2024, after what felt like some of the hardest work put into the game thus far, I would say that aside from a few relatively small things, the game's development was completed, and also a free demo was made available to play on Steam. And on top of that, I had also created a release announcement trailer which was scheduled and ready to go live at the beginning of 2025, which would announce the game's release as April 4th of that year. Even though the game was essentially finished, I scheduled the release months out for a couple of reasons, and I'm really glad that I did. First, I was feeling quite burnt out. If by some chance the game picked up any traction, I knew that the release could potentially be extremely busy. And on the other hand, if the game didn't do very well, I also wanted to be in a good mental state for that. So in November, to celebrate the game's completion, I took a long, well-needed trip with my wife to South Korea. My goal at this point was to give myself a bit of a break and also try to disconnect from the project. After working on it for so long, it was a big part of my identity, but I also felt ready to move on to something else, and that trip helped me put a lot of things into perspective. By the time I came back, I was as mentally prepared as I could be for both the game's release and the end of this long journey. And so I fixed up a couple final things, reached out to more press, premiered the release trailer on this YouTube channel, and created some final marketing material. I also participated in Steam Next Fest, which took place from February 24th to March 3rd, about a month before the game's release. I got some really great feedback during that, which boosted my confidence that the game was enjoyable, and my Steam wishlist numbers did also get a decent bump, but weren't anything impressive, sitting at a bit over 1,000. At this point, despite my efforts, I also still hadn't heard back from any press willing to cover the game. I had accepted that the game probably wasn't going to sell very well, but was also really proud of what I had created, and genuinely felt like I did the best I possibly could. And so that last month flew by like any other, and the day of April 4th, 2025 had come at last. And on that day, I released my game. Aside from a few bug fixes I did over the first week of release and putting out the last bit of social media that I had prepared, that was pretty much the end of the project. From any other indie game developer I've talked to, or even musicians, or really anyone else who's taken on and finished a long-running creative project like this, there seems to be a common sentiment. That is a huge feeling of emptiness and the need to move out into the woods and never see a computer again. And for me, that is exactly how I felt, but also accompanied by a feeling of relief. Almost half a decade is a long time to work on one project for. When starting this project, I was planning for a long-term endeavor, but I hadn't really accounted for how I was going to change over that time, how my interests would fluctuate, and how my values would evolve. For the final year or so of development, I felt like I was a slave to the project, and a big part of me just wanted to move on with my life. So, in short, if you asked me how I felt about the game's release at the time, which of course everyone I knew did, my response was that I was relieved that it was over, but also exhausted and a bit empty. I was no longer a slave to the project, but also I was still burnt out and I hadn't figured out what was next for me yet. And so, this last year since the game's release, I've been doing a lot of different things. I've been resting, exploring interests outside of game development, and recovering from burnout. I've been playing guitar a bit more, which is something that I had put down for a while because of how busy I had gotten with game development. I've prototyped out a bunch of different new product ideas in different domains that I'd be excited to pursue. And also, I've been pondering what I want to do with the Shaped by Rain Studios brand that I built, which I'll talk about more later. Anyways, now that you have a glimpse into what this journey looked like, I want to transition into talking through my thoughts on if the Path of Ren was a success or a failure, and I want to measure that in a few different ways. First, financially, I'll start with the facts. The game launched with a bit over 1,000 wishlists, which without a doubt is considered very low for those trying to make money on Steam. I'm not going to give the exact number or anything, but to date, a year after release, the game has passed around $1,000 in revenue. While this can seem like a nice chunk of money at first glance, when compared to the amount of time and energy I put into the game, I'd be lying to myself if I said this game was anything but a financial failure. But of course, the financial prospects weren't the main reason I set out on this journey in the first place. I also wanted to build a reputation in the game development world, which whether or not I feel like I succeeded or failed in that is a bit more complicated to answer. So did I create a reputation that I could build off of for another project? I would say my answer to this is yes. However, I'd also say that most of that reputation came from educational content I created on YouTube, not from the Path of Ren. So in retrospect, if it was really just reputation I was after, I probably could have abandoned the game when I found some success on YouTube, and I don't think actually finishing the game would have made that much of a difference. But what makes this answer even more complicated is that the audience I've built reputation with are game developers. Which, don't get me wrong here, I think that's amazing. But what that means for future projects is that if I want to leverage the brand that I've built, I need to lean into that audience, which does limit what I can do. For example, I don't really want to do paid courses, but I've built up the perfect audience for something like that. Likewise, if I wanted to make another video game, I do think the brand that I've built is better than nothing, but I also don't think it'd make that much of a difference in another video game's success. So for my final answer, when it comes to gaining reputation in the game development world, was the Path of Ren successful? I would say yes, but only as a compliment to the YouTube channel I built along the journey as well. The next success criteria I want to consider is how well I executed on my vision for the game, or put differently, did I build a good game? At the start of this journey, I didn't really know anything about art, and while the end result certainly isn't full of polished pixel art or anything, in my personal biased opinion, I'm extremely proud of how it looks. Likewise, I feel it plays well, and I feel it's quite polished for a precision platformer game. I also feel like the story evolved into exactly what I was trying to express, and is enjoyable all of the way through. And the music for the game is perfect, which of course was composed by Sad Ghost Sounds, not myself, but I did play a big part in driving the creative direction so that it would feel cohesive with the rest of the game, which I feel like we succeeded on. And when I look at the reviews on Steam by people who gave the game a try, they have lots of great things to say about it. And so for this criteria, although there's certainly room for improvement, I would call my execution of the game a success. And last, I want to look at this game as a success or failure from a spiritual perspective. And I know that word can mean a lot of different things to different people, but what I mean by it is my pursuit of purpose and fulfillment, since that was a huge factor in why I set out on this journey in the first place, and the game itself is also essentially about this at its core. And so, do I feel more fulfilled or more full of purpose after finishing the game? I'm going to say mostly no. I say mostly because releasing a game like this is a huge accomplishment that I certainly take pride in, and I do feel a level of fulfillment having achieved that. But I say no because finishing and releasing it ended up not actually meaning that much to me in the end. Which, to be fair, I imagine I might feel differently about if the game had gained more traction. But that's pretty hard to say, and also in a strange way I feel like a bit irrelevant. As part of editing this video, when I was looking back on these social media clips I created years ago now, I don't see a crudely drawn first draft of a main character. I see myself having started this incredible journey. I don't see the birdhouse checkpoints. I see myself working on this game with my green cheek conure, Taki, sitting on my shoulder, hearing me out and helping me make decisions. I don't see this flying mechanic that never even made its way into the final version of the game, but I do remember how accomplished I felt when I finally nailed this mechanic to feel exactly how I wanted it to feel. I don't see this older cut of the dialogue panel, but I hear the music I was listening to when I was creating it. I don't see the Path of Ren as anyone else does. I see it as a slightly younger version of myself, trying to navigate life's biggest unanswered questions about meaning, trying to be more vulnerable, and trying to express themselves. And without a doubt, succeeding. What's next for Shaped by Rain Studios? That's something that I've asked myself a lot this last year. My original intentions for after the game's release were to double down on creating educational content for this YouTube channel, but I've sat down a few times over the last year to try and create some tutorials, and the passion for that is just not there like it used to be. To be clear, I don't see that as a bad thing at all, it's more so just a shift in my interests. And I also wouldn't say that I'm done with tutorial style content forever or anything, I just don't have any plans to do that as of right now. So if it's not educational content, then what's next? Well, I had mentioned previously that I prototyped out a bunch of different product ideas over this last year, and for one of those ideas, I think it matches up with the audience I've attracted on this YouTube channel really well. And so that product idea is called RainForge, a self-hosted tool that automates the build and delivery process for video games, with its initial cut focused on building and deploying Unity projects to Steam. When I was working on the Path of Ren, I felt that preparing builds for Windows, Mac, and Linux, and then deploying all of those builds to Steam was way more complicated than it needed to be. And so I can only imagine how messy this could get for games with more complex build variants or that are deploying to more platforms than just Steam. Of course, there are already tools out there that can help automate this process, like GitHub Actions, GitLab Pipelines, Unity DevOps, Jenkins, and more. However, unless you have experience in CI/CD, which stands for Continuous Integration, Continuous Deployment, these tools have a rather steep learning curve in my opinion. And on top of that, some of these tools are cloud-based, which can be great if your project has the budget for it, but it also means that you'll end up paying varying fees for cloud resources, and potentially will be locked into whatever ecosystem that cloud infrastructure is on. RainForge is self-hosted, so you're in control of your data and you don't have to worry about varying cloud resource costs. It supports building across multiple machines, so you can choose whatever infrastructure you want, whether that be in the cloud or just another computer that you have lying around. And it aims to be simple to set up and use, so you're not spending days or even weeks automating your build and deployment process. My plans are that RainForge will be completely free to use for relatively simple Unity projects that deploy to Steam. However, for more complex Unity projects or to use some of the additional features it provides, it will be a paid product, which I'm still working out the exact details on, so I don't want to announce anything too specific about pricing or anything like that just yet. I built RainForge because I would have loved to have a tool like this when I was working on the Path of Ren. It's not available yet, but is set to release in early access sometime this year. So if this sounds interesting or useful to you, there's a waitlist you can sign up for which does two things. First, you'll be notified via email the moment RainForge becomes available. And second, it helps me know if there's actual interest in this product or not. So anyways, that's the next big project I'll be focusing on, and for how long just depends on how much traction I'm able to get with it. Something I've learned about myself throughout this game development journey is that I really enjoy helping creative people, and that includes game developers, musicians, artists, or really anyone else who is willing to put themselves out there and create something. So, when it comes to what's next for Shaped by Rain Studios, the more specific answer is RainForge, but the more broad answer is helping creative people do more of what they love doing. After all this talking about the game, I don't think I ever touched on what the story actually shaped up to be. The Path of Ren is about a boy who wakes up in an unfamiliar world with only a single memory, a white fox granting them a wish. They soon learn that there's a widespread legend in that world about a white fox. The legend goes that anyone who finds this elusive white fox will be granted any single wish of their choosing. However, there's no record of anyone ever actually finding the white fox, and it's not clear if the fox ever even existed, or if this is just a fairy tale. But, regardless, that boy goes on a journey to try and find it anyways. A year later now, thank you for watching, and thank you so much to everyone who was a part of this journey. It's certainly one that I will never forget.